What do you call a sniper who cannot hit the target? The question drifted across the firing line with a sharp edge of sarcasm, followed by a few uneasy laughs that quickly disappeared beneath the steady crack of rifles echoing through the valley. Gunnery Sergeant Ryan Mercer lowered his spotting scope and clenched his jaw. 300 rounds had already been fired since sunrise. 300 carefully calculated attempts, each backed by advanced optics, digital ballistic software, laser range finders, and weather sensors worth more than most family cars. Yet the small steel silhouette, standing nearly 1 mile away, remained untouched. Heat shimmered above the rocky terrain like waves rising from an invisible fire. Tiny range flags fluttered in conflicting directions, and every Marine on the line trusted the numbers displayed on glowing screens more than the landscape stretching before them. Again, Mercer ordered. Another sniper settled behind his precision rifle. His breathing slowed. The trigger broke with perfect discipline. Seconds later, the distant observer quietly shook his head. Another miss. A heavy silence settled over the firing line. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to become the next target of Mercer's frustration. At the edge of the range, beyond the equipment trucks and stacks of ammunition crates, an elderly man stood alone beside the chain-link safety fence. Daniel Brooks looked nothing like the Marines surrounding him. His faded denim jacket had been washed so many times the blue had nearly turned gray. A worn canvas rifle case rested against one leg, while an old leather satchel hung comfortably from one shoulder. Deep lines crossed his weathered face, and his white hair moved gently whenever the afternoon breeze shifted across the valley. He watched without interrupting, his pale blue eyes following the movement of dust, distant grass, and the slow dance of hawks circling high above the ridgeline. He did not seem interested in the rifles. He appeared far more interested in the wind itself. Lance Corporal Ethan Carter noticed him first. The old man had been standing there for almost 20 minutes without speaking to anyone. There was something unusual about his stillness. Visitors usually wandered, asked questions, or took photographs. Daniel simply observed. He carried himself with the quiet patience of someone who had spent a lifetime waiting for exactly the right moment. Ryan Mercer finally spotted him and walked over with the brisk confidence of a Marine who expected immediate obedience. "Sir, this is a restricted live fire range," he said. "Family tours are on the other side of the base. You cannot stay here." Daniel turned toward him with an almost apologetic smile. "I'm not here for the tour." Mercer crossed his arms. "Then why are you here?" Daniel looked back toward the distant target before answering. "Someone asked me to stop by." Mercer glanced around the range. None of the instructors recognized the old man. None of the range officers seemed to know who he was either. One of the younger Marines laughed quietly. "Maybe he is here to show us how they did it 50 years ago." A few others joined the laughter. Daniel never reacted. He simply continued studying the valley between the firing line and the steel silhouette. Mercer noticed the old canvas rifle case leaning beside him and raised an eyebrow. "You planning to use that antique?" Daniel rested one hand lightly against the case. "Only if someone needs it." More laughter spread across the firing line. To every Marine standing there, the answer sounded like another harmless joke from an elderly visitor who did not understand how much precision, science, and technology modern marksmanship required. None of them realized the old man was not looking at the target at all. He was watching everything the bullet would have to cross before it ever reached it. Daniel Brooks remained standing beside the safety fence as though time moved differently around him. The afternoon breeze rolled gently across the valley, carrying the dry scent of sun-baked earth and freshly cut grass, while distant range flags fluttered in ways that seemed almost impossible to predict. Most of the Marines ignored them completely. Their attention remained fixed on glowing digital displays, laser range data, and carefully calculated firing solutions. Lance. Corporal Ethan Carter found himself glancing back toward the elderly visitor every few seconds. There was nothing remarkable about Daniel's appearance. His faded denim jacket had seen better decades. His boots carried the pale dust of countless roads, and the canvas rifle case beside him looked as though it had traveled farther than anyone cared to imagine. Yet the old man stood with an effortless balance that Ethan had rarely seen outside experienced instructors. Ryan Mercer returned to the firing line, determined to prove the previous misses had been nothing more than difficult conditions. "Run the calculations again," he ordered. "Adjust 1/10 left for the crosswind and account for the temperature shift." The spotter immediately entered fresh data while another Marine settled behind the precision rifle. Every movement followed textbook procedure. Breathing slowed. The reticle steadied. The trigger broke with practiced discipline. Several long seconds passed before the distant observer quietly lowered his binoculars and shook his head once more. Another miss. Frustration rippled across the firing line. Mercer stared at the ballistic display in disbelief. "The numbers are perfect." Daniel spoke so quietly that only Ethan heard him at first. "The numbers only describe where they were measured." Ethan looked toward him. "Sir," Daniel lifted his eyes toward the valley. "The bullet has to travel through places your instruments never touch." Ethan followed the old man's gaze. The nearest range flag leaned steadily from right to left, yet farther downrange a ribbon of dust drifted almost the opposite direction. Above a line of dark rocks, shimmering waves of heated air twisted upward before disappearing into cooler currents near the tree line. Daniel seemed to notice every subtle movement without effort. Ethan quietly asked, "You are reading the wind?" Daniel smiled gently. "Not only the wind." Before Ethan could ask another question, Mercer overheard enough to turn back toward them. "With respect, sir, modern Marine snipers do not guess. We calculate." Daniel nodded politely. "Good. You should calculate." Mercer folded his arms with growing confidence. "Then we agree." Daniel's expression never changed. "Calculation tells you where to begin. Observation tells you when the calculation is no longer enough." A few nearby Marines exchanged amused smiles. One whispered that every old hunter believed experience could outperform science. Another joked that perhaps the old man wanted them to check the clouds instead of the computers. Quiet laughter spread along the firing line. Daniel ignored every word. His attention never left the distant valley. A red-tailed hawk drifted across the ridgeline without a single wing beat before banking sharply into another invisible current. Daniel watched it for several seconds before softly saying, almost to himself, "Even the birds trust the air more than the numbers." Ethan felt something shift inside him. The old man never sounded defensive. He never argued. He simply described what he saw with complete certainty. For reasons Ethan could not explain, that quiet confidence unsettled him far more than the loud certainty surrounding the firing line. Somewhere beyond the command building, the sound of another vehicle approaching echoed across the base, while Daniel Brooks remained perfectly still, patiently watching the unseen path every bullet had failed to understand. Ryan Mercer refused to believe the range itself could be defeating his Marines. He crouched beside the firing position and stared at the digital display mounted next to the spotting scope. Every measurement appeared flawless. Distance had been confirmed 3 separate times. Atmospheric pressure matched the latest forecast. Temperature had changed by less than 2 degrees. Wind speed remained comfortably within acceptable limits. By every modern standard, the shot should have been routine. Yet another report echoed across the valley, followed several long seconds later by complete silence from the distant target. The observer slowly raised one hand and signaled another miss. Mercer lowered his head and muttered something beneath his breath before standing abruptly. "Run every calculation again," he ordered. "Check the optics. Verify the laser. Confirm every variable." The sniper team immediately returned to work, fingers moving across tablets and ballistic computers with practiced confidence. Daniel Brooks quietly watched without offering another word. His attention never settled on the expensive equipment spread across folding tables. Instead, he watched a patch of tall grass nearly halfway downrange bending gently toward the east while the nearest range flag leaned toward the west. A cloud drifted across the afternoon sun, cooling one section of rocky ground while another remained shimmering with heat. Ethan Carter followed Daniel's eyes instead of the computer's. For the first time all afternoon, he realized the valley itself never stopped changing. "Sir," Ethan asked softly, "are you saying the computers are wrong?" Daniel smiled politely. "No, they're doing exactly what they were designed to do." Ethan looked confused. "Then why do the shots keep missing?" Daniel glanced toward the distant hillside before answering. "Because the valley does not know it is supposed to behave like a computer model." Ethan considered the answer while another Marine approached, carrying a handheld weather station. "Crosswind is steady," the Marine announced confidently. Daniel looked toward the instrument and then back toward the sky. "Only where you were standing." One of the younger snipers overheard him and laughed. "Next, he's going to tell us the wind has feelings." Several others smiled, relieved to laugh at something after hours of frustration. Ryan Mercer folded his arms. "We trust data here." Daniel nodded without the slightest hint of disagreement. "You should." Mercer raised an eyebrow. "But..." Daniel slowly pointed toward a red-tailed hawk gliding above the valley without flapping its wings. "Tell me what your instrument says about that." Every eye followed the bird for a brief moment. It drifted effortlessly before banking sharply into an invisible current that no flag had revealed. The laughter faded. Nobody answered. Daniel lowered his hand. Nature leaves clues everywhere. The question is whether someone still remembers how to read them. Mercer quickly dismissed the moment with another impatient wave. "Interesting philosophy, but we are training Marine snipers, not bird watchers." Daniel simply smiled again. "Sometimes the birds graduate before we do." Ethan struggled not to smile, but his curiosity had grown into genuine respect. There was no arrogance in Daniel's voice, no attempt to embarrass anyone. Every sentence sounded less like criticism and more like a lesson quietly waiting for someone willing to hear it. As another firing solution was prepared, a dark government sport utility vehicle rolled onto the gravel access road near the range headquarters. A senior operations officer stepped out, speaking urgently into his phone while scanning the firing line. Ethan noticed him immediately. Daniel noticed him as well, though his expression never changed. Ryan Mercer remained completely focused on proving the old man wrong, unaware that events beyond the range had already begun moving in a direction none of them expected. Ryan Mercer walked toward Daniel Brooks with the impatient confidence of a man determined to prove that experience had finally been replaced by technology. Behind him, another Marine carefully packed away a spotting scope while instructors debated atmospheric readings that refused to make sense. Every conversation sounded different, yet every conclusion ended exactly the same way. No one could explain why perfectly calculated shots continued missing the distant steel target. Daniel remained still, his weathered eyes following a faint ribbon of dust drifting across the valley before disappearing behind a line of scrub brush. He seemed completely detached from the growing frustration surrounding him. Mercer stopped only a few feet away and nodded toward the faded canvas rifle case resting against Daniel's boot. "That old thing has probably been retired longer than some of my Marines have been alive." Daniel smiled politely. "Probably." Mercer chuckled. "Let me guess. You still think wood and steel can outperform carbon fiber and precision machining?" Daniel gently shook his head. "I think the person holding the rifle matters more than the material around the barrel." Several nearby Marines exchanged amused glances. One quietly muttered that every generation believed the next one had forgotten something important. Mercer crouched beside the old rifle case and examined the cracked leather straps holding it closed. Time had darkened every buckle, while years of careful handling had polished the edges until they reflected the afternoon sunlight. Curious more than respectful, Mercer reached forward and released one of the brass fasteners. Daniel did not stop him. The flap folded back slowly, revealing the rich walnut stock of a beautifully maintained rifle resting inside. There were no electronic optics, no folding chassis, no adjustable cheek rest, only clean lines shaped by another era. The walnut carried countless tiny marks collected through decades of careful use, but one long scar near the receiver immediately caught Mercer's attention. He traced the smooth groove with a fingertip and laughed softly. Looks like somebody was rough on their equipment. Daniel's eyes settled quietly on the scar. For an instant, the bright afternoon faded beneath another sky entirely. The dry scent of sun-baked grass disappeared, replaced by warm jungle air carrying the fragrance of damp leaves and rain-soaked earth. Towering trees filtered pale sunlight through layers of green, while distant birds suddenly burst from the canopy all at once. A much younger Daniel steadied the same walnut stock against his shoulder. The fresh scrape along the wood had only appeared minutes earlier after the rifle slid across a rocky slope during a hurried climb. Beside him, an older Marine instructor rested one hand briefly on the stock and smiled. A scar only matters if it keeps you from doing your job. Young Daniel looked down at the damaged wood before lifting his eyes back toward the valley ahead. It still shoots straight. The instructor nodded with quiet satisfaction. Then stop worrying about the scar and pay attention to the wind. The memory dissolved as gently as it had arrived. Daniel blinked once and found himself standing once again beneath the clear afternoon sky of the modern range. Mercer still wore the same amused expression, completely unaware that his casual touch had awakened a lesson carried across half a century. Daniel carefully closed the canvas flap and secured the worn brass buckle with slow, deliberate hands. His voice remained calm, almost thoughtful. Some marks remind you what survived. Ethan Carter watched the exchange in complete silence. The laughter from the other Marines had already begun to fade. For reasons he could not explain, the old rifle no longer looked outdated. It looked trusted. The scar beneath Daniel Brooks's fingertips carried far more than worn wood. As his hand rested quietly against the old walnut stock, the years slipped away with the soft rustle of jungle leaves moving beneath a humid afternoon sky. The modern rifle range vanished, replaced by towering trees whose branches filtered sunlight in as scattered ribbons across the forest floor. Warm air pressed against young faces already soaked with sweat, carrying the rich scent of damp earth, moss, and rain lingering from an early morning storm. Every sound seemed magnified. Water dripped steadily from broad leaves. Tiny insects hummed beneath tangled vines. Somewhere high above, unseen birds suddenly fell silent all at once. Young Daniel Brooks lay motionless behind a fallen tree, the same rifle resting naturally against his shoulder. The fresh scrape across the walnut stock had appeared only hours earlier after the rifle slid across rough stone during a difficult climb. He studied the mark for only a moment before lifting his eyes toward the valley below. Beside him, Lance Corporal Thomas Reed carefully adjusted a notebook filled with range sketches and whispered, "The wind keeps changing every minute." Daniel answered without taking his eyes away from the distant hillside. The wind never promised to stay the same. Reed frowned. "Then how do you know when to take the shot?" Daniel slowly watched a single leaf drifting across a narrow beam of sunlight before it disappeared into deeper shade. "I do not wait for the wind to become perfect," he said quietly. "I wait until I understand what it is trying to do." The older Marine instructor positioned a few feet behind them smiled without interrupting. He had spent decades teaching marksmanship, yet he rarely corrected Daniel anymore. Instead, he simply observed. "What do you see?" the instructor finally asked. Daniel never looked away from the valley. Warm air climbing the rocks. Cooler air sliding beneath the trees. The birds changed direction before the leaves did. Something farther down is pushing everything uphill. The instructor nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Good. Most people only see the target. The best marksmen study everything between themselves and the target." Daniel breathed slowly, not forcing stillness, but allowing it to arrive naturally. His attention rested not on the rifle, nor on the distant hillside alone, but on the invisible path connecting them both. The lesson had never been about squeezing a trigger. It had always been about patience, about observation, about respecting things too subtle for instruments to measure. After several long moments, the instructor placed one steady hand upon Daniel's shoulder. "Remember this for the rest of your life," he said softly. "Technology changes. Landscapes change. Even rifles change. Human impatience never does. The words settled deep inside the young Marine with a weight no classroom could ever provide. The jungle slowly dissolved beneath the warmth of another afternoon many decades later. The scent of wet earth faded into dry grass, carried across the modern rifle range. Daniel blinked once and found Ryan Mercer still standing before him, unaware that only a heartbeat had separated two lifetimes. Mercer continued studying the old rifle with polite disbelief before giving a small shrug. Hard to believe anyone still keeps one like this. Daniel gently secured the worn leather strap around the rifle case and offered a faint smile. Some things are worth taking care of, he answered quietly. Ethan Carter watched the exchange in complete silence. He no longer saw an elderly visitor carrying an outdated rifle. He saw a man whose calm seemed forged by lessons that time itself had never managed to erase. Daniel Brooks remained standing quietly beside the firing line, while the afternoon breeze continued tracing invisible paths across the valley. Behind him, Ryan Mercer called for another round of calculations, refusing to believe the answer could exist anywhere outside the glowing screens spread across the equipment tables. Another sniper settled behind the rifle with textbook precision. Laser range confirmation appeared. Atmospheric pressure updated. Wind values refreshed. Every indicator suggested success. Seconds later, another report echoed across the valley, followed once again by the disappointing silence that had haunted the range since sunrise. Mercer slowly lowered his spotting scope. His frustration was becoming impossible to hide. Ethan Carter looked toward Daniel instead of the target. The old veteran had not reacted to the latest miss. His attention remained fixed on the ridgeline where a single red-tailed hawk drifted effortlessly through shifting currents without a single unnecessary movement. Ethan finally spoke. "Sir, how do you always know where to look?" Daniel smiled gently. "I do not always know. I simply start by looking where everyone else stopped." Ethan considered the answer before quietly asking another question. "Were you a sniper?" Daniel looked toward the valley for several long seconds before replying. "I spent a long time learning from people who understood patience better than I did." Before Ethan could continue, Gunnery Sergeant Michael Harris stepped out of the operations trailer, carrying an old 3-ring binder tucked beneath one arm. His face had changed completely. The casual confidence of an experienced range master had been replaced by careful respect. He approached Daniel slowly, stopping several feet away before speaking. "Mr. Brooks." Daniel turned with the same calm expression. "Good afternoon, Gunny." Harris hesitated for only a moment before extending the binder. "Would you mind looking at something?" Daniel accepted it without surprise. Inside rested faded photographs, aging qualification records, and handwritten instructor notes preserved across decades of Marine marksmanship history. One photograph had already been opened. It showed a much younger Daniel standing beside several instructors after completing an advanced sniper course. The walnut stock rifle rested across his arms. Even in the faded image, the scar near the receiver was clearly visible. Ethan leaned forward in disbelief. "That is you." Daniel looked at the photograph only briefly before closing the binder again. "That was a long time ago." Harris nodded respectfully. Some people here still remember the stories. Ryan Mercer overheard the conversation and walked over, curiosity finally replacing skepticism. "Stories." Harris looked directly at him. "Not stories. Training history." Mercer frowned. "Nobody mentioned any of this." Harris answered quietly. "Because very few names stay in the curriculum for 50 years. Mercer stared at Daniel, trying to reconcile the quiet elderly visitor with the young Marine standing inside the faded photograph. Before anyone spoke again, the secure phone clipped to Harris's belt vibrated. He stepped several paces away before answering. His posture immediately stiffened. "Yes, Colonel. He is still here." "Yes, sir." "Understood." Harris ended the call and returned without delay. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable weight. "Mr. Brooks, Colonel William Hayes requests that you remain on the range for a few more minutes." Daniel simply nodded. "Of course." Mercer looked confused. "The colonel knows him?" Harris met his eyes. The colonel is not the only one. Far beyond the firing line, the low rumble of approaching engines drifted across the base once again. Daniel turned his eyes back toward the valley instead of the road, quietly watching another ribbon of warm air rise from the rocks, as though the wind itself still had one final lesson waiting to be revealed. The secure phone call ended, but its effects spread across the installation faster than any spoken order. Colonel William Hayes stepped out of the headquarters building with unusual urgency, accompanied by two senior officers who rarely left command meetings before they concluded. None of them looked toward the demonstration schedule posted outside the operations center. Their attention remained fixed on one destination alone: Long Ridge Range. Inside the operations trailer, Gunnery Sergeant Michael Harris quietly clipped the secure phone back onto his belt before turning toward Ethan Carter. "You asked the right question," he said softly. Ethan looked puzzled. "I only wanted to know who he was." Harris gave a faint smile. "Sometimes that is the most important question a Marine can ask." Outside, Daniel Brooks stood exactly where he had been all afternoon. The wind continued moving across the valley in slow, invisible layers, while another sniper prepared for yet another carefully calculated attempt. Ryan Mercer still refused to surrender to doubt. "Run the solution one more time," he instructed. "There has to be a variable we missed." The spotter entered fresh atmospheric readings. The ballistic computer recalculated instantly. Every value appeared flawless. Another report rolled across the range. Several long seconds later, the observer lowered his binoculars once again without raising a success flag. Mercer slowly exhaled through clenched teeth. The silence that followed felt heavier than every missed attempt before it. Daniel never commented. He simply watched a ribbon of dry grass bending halfway down the valley while the nearest range flag leaned in a completely different direction. Ethan stood beside him now instead of beside the firing line. He no longer felt embarrassed by the old veteran's quiet observations. Instead, he found himself studying the same landscape. For the first time since arriving that morning, he stopped looking only at the target. He noticed the shimmer rising above sunlit rocks. He noticed the shadow of passing clouds cooling one section of the hillside, while another remained bright. He even noticed the hawk Daniel had watched all afternoon, gliding effortlessly through currents no instrument had recorded. Daniel spoke without taking his eyes away from the valley. "You are beginning to see it." Ethan smiled slightly. "I think I am beginning to notice how much I was missing." Daniel nodded. "That is where learning begins." The distant rumble of approaching engines interrupted their conversation. Several black government vehicles rolled slowly through the security gate before turning toward the range. They carried no flashing lights and no unnecessary escort, yet every sentry they passed instinctively stood straighter. Ryan Mercer finally turned toward the access road. "Who is coming?" Before anyone answered, Colonel Hayes stepped out of the lead vehicle and walked directly toward Daniel Brooks without hesitation. The colonel stopped a respectful distance away and offered a firm handshake. "Mr. Brooks," he said warmly, "I was hoping I would see you again someday." Daniel returned the handshake with the same quiet smile. "Good afternoon, Colonel." Ryan Mercer stared in complete disbelief. The senior officers accompanying Hayes remained silent, almost waiting. Mercer looked toward Harris. "The colonel knows him personally?" Harris answered without taking his eyes off Daniel. "Long before either of us wore these uniforms." Hayes glanced toward the firing line where another rifle rested and used on its mat. Then he looked back at Daniel. "Would you do these Marines a favor?" Daniel tilted his head slightly. "If I can." Hayes smiled. "Show them what patience looks like." Major General Richard Donovan stepped onto the firing line with the calm confidence of a man who understood exactly why he had come. Nearly 20 minutes had passed since Colonel Hayes made the call. Enough time for the command vehicle to arrive without unnecessary urgency, but with unmistakable purpose. Every conversation stopped. Even the steady rhythm of range operations seemed to fade beneath the weight of quiet expectation. Donovan greeted Colonel Hayes with a brief nod before walking directly toward Daniel Brooks. The elderly veteran stood exactly where he had been all afternoon, one hand resting lightly on the worn canvas rifle case, while the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the gravel. "It has been too many years, Mr. Brooks," Donovan said warmly. Daniel returned the smile. "Time moves faster than either of us expects, General." The two men shook hands with the ease of old professionals who needed no introductions. Ryan Mercer watched in stunned silence. Only hours earlier, he had assumed the quiet visitor was simply another retired civilian wandering too close to a restricted training area. Now a four-star general was greeting him with unmistakable respect. Donovan slowly turned toward the firing line. "Colonel Hayes tells me your Marines have spent the better part of today chasing the wrong answer." Mercer straightened immediately. "We have exhausted every approved firing solution, sir." Donovan nodded. "Then perhaps it is time to learn another way of seeing." He looked back toward Daniel. "Would you be willing to help them?" Daniel hesitated for only a moment before answering. "If the lesson belongs to them, not to me." Donovan smiled. "That is exactly why I asked." The range safety officer stepped forward and calmly verified the firing lane was clear. He inspected the precision rifle, confirmed the chamber was empty, supervised the loading of a single cartridge, and announced that the range was approved for one demonstration shot. Every Marine present understood the procedure. Nothing about what would happen next ignored discipline or safety. Daniel accepted the rifle with quiet appreciation. He did not admire it as though it were unfamiliar, nor did he compare it to the rifle resting inside his weathered case. He simply balanced it naturally in his hands before settling behind the firing position. The ballistic computer remained untouched beside him. The weather station continued displaying numbers no one bothered to read. Daniel lifted his eyes beyond the optic and studied the valley itself. A narrow shadow from a passing cloud drifted across the rocky slope halfway to the target before slowly moving on. Fine dust lifted briefly along a dry wash before disappearing again. A cluster of sagebrush swayed gently, while a line of taller pines farther downrange barely moved at all. Daniel watched every detail without hurry. "The land is speaking," he said softly. "You only have to stop interrupting it." Ethan Carter stood motionless beside the firing line, absorbing every word. Ryan Mercer found himself watching the landscape instead of the rifle for the first time all day. Daniel finally lowered his eye behind the optic. His breathing remained slow and steady. He made one small adjustment to the rifle's position and then became perfectly still. No one reached for a calculator. No one offered another correction. The entire range waited in complete silence, not because they expected a miracle, but because they had finally begun to understand that mastery sometimes arrives without announcing itself. Daniel Brooks remained perfectly still until the breeze settled into the quiet rhythm he had been waiting for since the moment he arrived. His breathing slowed naturally, not because he forced it, but because years of patient discipline had made calm his normal state. The rifle rested steadily against his shoulder while every Marine on the firing line watched without speaking. Ryan Mercer no longer looked at the ballistic computer beside him. Ethan Carter no longer searched the weather station for answers. Even Major General Richard Donovan stood silently with his hands behind his back, allowing the moment to belong entirely to the old veteran. Daniel's finger moved with deliberate control, and the report echoed cleanly across the valley before fading into the distant hills. No one celebrated. No one spoke. Every eye remained fixed on the steel silhouette standing nearly a mile away beneath the afternoon sun. For one long heartbeat, there was only silence. Then the clear metallic ring drifted back across the open valley, carried gently by the same wind that had frustrated the range all day. The sound was unmistakable. The distant range observer slowly raised one arm before giving a firm signal that everyone could see. The target had been struck cleanly. A deep silence settled over the firing line, unlike anything Ryan Mercer had experienced in his career. It was not surprise alone. It was respect arriving all at once. Daniel calmly opened the rifle's action, confirmed it was clear, and handed the weapon back to Mercer with both hands exactly as he had received it. "Thank you for trusting me with it," he said quietly. Mercer accepted the rifle almost reverently. His voice carried none of the confidence that had filled it earlier that afternoon. "Sir, I owe you an apology." Daniel smiled gently. "You do not owe me anything." Mercer lowered his eyes. "I judged you before I understood who you were." Daniel shook his head softly. "That happens more often than people realize. The important part is deciding what you will do after you learn the truth." Ethan Carter stood listening, knowing he would remember those words for the rest of his life. Major General Donovan stepped forward and looked across the assembled Marines. "Today was never about proving that old methods are better than new ones," he said calmly. "It was about remembering that technology can support experience, but it can never replace wisdom." Every Marine listened without moving. Donovan then turned toward Daniel and raised a precise military salute. Without receiving a command, Colonel Hayes followed. Gunnery Sergeant Harris followed. Ryan Mercer did the same. One by one, every Marine on the firing line stood at attention and rendered a salute to the quiet veteran who had asked for nothing and expected even less. Daniel returned the salute with calm dignity before lowering his hand. He picked up the worn canvas rifle case, adjusted the faded leather satchel over his shoulder, and looked once more across the valley where the wind continued tracing invisible paths through the afternoon light. Nothing about the landscape had changed. Only the people standing within it had. Without another word, Daniel walked slowly toward the parking area until the distance gradually carried him beyond the line of waiting vehicles. No cameras followed him. No speeches delayed him. The Marines simply watched him leave in thoughtful silence, each carrying away a lesson no manual could fully explain. Respect is never earned by demanding attention. It is earned by a lifetime of quiet excellence that speaks long after the last shot has faded into the wind.